Good morning to you and everybody watching online. Welcome to the Introduction to the Long-Term Plan workshop. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Councillor Shannon. And yes, this is the big kick-off session for our Intro to Long-Term Plan. We've obviously had a few papers to Council with regards to timelines. We've had some introductory papers go to Strategic Planning and Development and Growth Committee on their delegated work streams, but this is really the kick-off to the overall LTP process. Topics we're going to run through today are these ones here on the slide. So what is an LTP and why does it matter? Legislative requirements and key sections. So we'll be able to skip through those pretty quickly. Then we get into the impacts of reform. There's quite a bit of detail in there with recent announcements of particularly Head Start and also further information released proactively on the System Improvements Bill, which directly affects the Local Government Act 2002. From there, we'll move into looking at the strategic direction, and that will cover the vision, the values and roles and the priorities that are in the current LTP 24 to 34. In that section, we'll be looking at those current components against the current legislation versus what's proposed in the System Improvements Bill and within the context of reform too, so we can look at what sort of scope we'll be needing to tackle with regards to strategic direction. Then we'll go into a 10-year financial forecast, a general discussion and next steps, and then we'll have a quick public excluded discussion on some more of the detail with reform, and Elliot will be here to offer any advice and answer any questions.
So we're looking in this part of the meeting for the context of local government reform and what that means for our LTP, or this is more high level and we'll look at that in a different format?
Yeah, so there is a bit of detail in the impacts of reform, specifically what clauses are directly and indirectly affected with regards to LTP and the development.
Yeah.
And then also the wider context too, like what does Head Start look like for the LTP process and for the organisation moving forward in our district and communities.
Saw that in the papers. I was looking from more of a blunt perspective of actually, the value of all this based on that, but that's right.
Yeah. Cool. So we'll kick in. What is the long-term plan? It is essentially this big book is the document. The shortest answer is it's our contract with the community and we develop it with the community. So the statutory purposes are it describes the activities of the local authority, describes the community outcomes of the local authority's district or region, provides integrated decision-making and coordination of the resources of the local authority, provides long-term focus for the decisions and activities of the local authority, and provides a basis for accountability of the local authority to the community. Is there any questions on what the LTP actually is? Perfect. So there are quite a few legislative requirements. This is based on the current Local Government Act as it is today. We'll unpack what the System Improvements Bill does to some of these requirements later on. So the strategic direction I've touched on prior, and we'll unpack that a bit further. Financial and infrastructure strategies, although they are separate sections within the LTP, they are very much linked and must talk to each other and be coherent. Forecast financial information, there's a lot of specific requirements in there. The rating-based information, development of Māori capacity and contribution to decision-making. Groups of activities, that's one that is, proposed to be directly impacted by the recent announcement last Wednesday. CCOs, policies, there's quite a few in there. Variations between the long-term plan and sanitary services and waste management plans, and significant assumptions and risks. There is other information dotted throughout the LTP, but essentially we have to make sure that all those legislative requirements are coherent, they talk to each other. It's quite the web when you unpack what an excellent LTP looks like. Could you please click the screen, Megan? Thank you. So one of the key sections we'll be focusing on today is the strategic direction. The discussion today is basically an open floor discussion to get a feel from elected members of what the scope of the review of that strategic direction needs to look like moving forward, so we can scope something up and start unpacking it further in workshops. Financial strategy, the requirements are set out in section 101A. I didn't list them because they're quite long and the terminology in there is quite dry. But essentially it's how is the organisation going to fund all the activities we do at a high level? What sort of debt to revenue ratio are we happy with? That's your big picture thinking. Any questions on either of those sections? Perfect. The infrastructure strategy, so we've started unpacking that with the Development and Growth Committee. As saying goes, best laid plans. We got endorsement on the scope of the infrastructure strategy last Tuesday at the committee meeting, and on Wednesday the proactive release came out with the proposed mandatory groups, which changes the scope of the infrastructure strategy, which we will begin to unpack with Development and Growth Committee and what that might look like. The financial information, that's about, I'd say, a fifth to a quarter of what's in this LTP document. There are a lot of legislative requirements that must be included in the financial information. Groups of activities, as I said with the infrastructure strategy, the proposed changes to the mandatory groups provide a challenge. We're expecting the exposure draft to come through early June. So yeah, as we work through what that might look like, in the meantime, it's about ensuring that we focus our efforts on evidence gathering so that no matter what the scope looks like with those mandatory groups when they are hopefully confirmed, we're well placed to be able to move things around and not have too many issues. There is also an interdependency here with the altitude upgrade. If those mandatory groups do come to fruition, then we will need to be able to report on them. Therefore, the GL structure needs to be able to enable the reporting. So we may need to look at some of the risks in the altitude upgrade as well and pull forward the GL restructure. I've spoken to Sam about that and flagged that with her. So we're going to have a slightly deeper chat about what that might mean. So in the groups of activities sections for each group, we must be able to list the activities within it, why council delivers them and the community outcomes they support, and then also flag significant negative effects on the community wellbeing. It needs to include all the capital expenditure for that group. That includes whether it is a renewal, a level of service increase or an acquisition, so a brand new asset, and also needs to show whether it's a demand or growth. Statement of service provisions. So this one is a bit tricky because under the proactive release on the regulated groups, there is also potentially going to be specific measures and frameworks that all councils need to abide by too. So we're going to have to wait for a bit more detail about that and what that might look like. But essentially it might limit the amount of choice that council has in what measures that we set, the targets and how and when we report on those. And then a funding impact statement for each group as well. Significant forecasting assumptions. This one's particularly tricky with this LTP. We'll unpack some communication we had from Audit and PX later today. Depending on what, for example, what we put forward as a proposal if that happens to the Head Start process, we will need to figure out how we're going to quantify that in a forecasting assumption in the LTP and then reflect that throughout the whole document too. Yeah, in our current LTP, we've split them into 4 categories, which are population and growth, operational assumptions, external assumptions. That's things like economic forecasting that we get out of the Bill report, and then also all the financial assumptions as well, which also need to feed through and be coherent throughout the whole LTP document. Any questions on any of those? Cool. So then we look at what information underpins all these components. This information is not just for LTP, this is across the whole organisation and how it operates. It will be very beneficial to other significant work streams like spatial planning, potential amalgamation. Yeah, this information is critical for everything that council does and how it does it. Asset and activity management plans. The asset management plans, we've got development and growth having oversight over the creation and or updates depending on which activity it pertains to. If the mandatory groups do progress, we will have a lot of work to do in some of the new groups, which we will also look at further in the reform section. Any questions about any of those work streams? Cool. So, impacts of reform. The Water Services Act and Local Water Done Well has significantly impacted this LTP. We're going to need to understand what the organisation is going to look like when water and wastewater are moved out to the new water organisation. I haven't put too much detail around this one because we're all pretty well aware that this is going to, well, it was basically the catalyst for reshaping what local government looks like moving forward. There is still a decision to be made by councils in the Joint Shareholder Committee on where stormwater sits. That's probably the next big decision that we need to tick off pretty quickly. The Local Government System Improvements Amendment Bill. This amendment bill and the clauses within it directly affect the Local Government Act. So this is going to have the biggest direct impact on what is in the LTP. Resource management reform, I've got Aaron coming up at about 11. He can talk to what that looks like for the LTP, but more for the wider organisation and within that spatial planning. And then simplifying local government, that is the other one that's significantly going to change, not so much directly the LTP, but more about what the organisation looks like and how we reflect that in the LTP going forward.
Sorry, what about the development levies reform? Whereabouts does that sit in this? Because that will be quite a big one too, won't it?
Yep, so
Resource management.
yeah, so it kind of sits in resource management, but also there's the policy requirements in the LTP as well. So currently it's your financial development contributions, but how we get ready to be able to implement the development levies is, yeah, it's going to require a lot of that underlying information, which is your asset and activity management plans. Yep.
But I've struggled to figure out where that one does sit, because there's something to do with like the infrastructure, something.
Yeah.
Bill as well, or something. There's another section of that, isn't there?
Yeah. So it requires really solid evidence on your asset management planning, your demand and growth assumptions, and then I can't remember the exact timing. I think it's like maybe early 28 or 29. that we have to be able to have that development levies in effect. But we'll spring that one on Elliot when he gets here. That's okay. Any other questions on the reforms at this level? Cool, so this slide is a summary of the impacts. As I said before, the System Improvements Bill is the one that most directly affects the LTP development and what is in the LTP. It's updating the purpose of local government, the core services that councils must have regard to, is the terminology that's in there. There's another financial reporting requirement that we have to be able to report on contractors and consultants. We're pretty well placed to do that because we have that set up in the GL already, but that will be stricter reporting. And the proposed 8 new groups of activities. So attached to this, there's some more information on attachment 1 that was uploaded to the hub, and also attachment 2, which is the proactive release. Any questions on any of that?
It's always that loose language in these things, especially in local government, must have regard to, but it's such a loose thing. You know, what is the statutory requirement as to the explanation for have regard to? Because in the RMA, in the old RMA, there was a lot of that, but case law completely usurped it. But in local government, there is no vehicle for that. So what is having regard to something? I looked at it.
Yeah, I think if you look at that legislation as a whole, and then also look at meeting the current and future needs of your community, and then you add in the proposed 8 new groups that unpack the activities that sit underneath those, I guess, higher activity descriptions, when you put it all together, having regard to makes it quite clear that in developing your LTP, you need to very clearly understand the current and future needs of your community in considering these activities and what council delivers. Yeah.
So
It's quite messy, but yeah.
It's quite interesting, some of these, because they're actually starting to, we're running out of runway to actually really understand them and put them into place. And the one at the right, the simplifying LG Head Start, 5th of May announced. It will soon be the 5th of June, so we've lost one of the 3 months already.
Cool, so we'll skim over RM reform, and hopefully Aaron's watching online and he can come up shortly. But moving into the simplifying local government, to tie it in with what has been included in the proactive release on the groups of activities, it's very clear that Central has looked at how everything links together, because within those groups of activities in the System Improvements Bill, it has already specified what activities the regional councils do and put them into some of the groups. So everything's already linking together. It's making sure that we understand what the impacts of any proposal will have on our LTP development. The LTP is 10 years, so how we frame up and quantify how those assumptions look over the 10-year period based on the timeframes that are set under Head Start, we're going to have to give effect to whatever we include in the proposal. I had a chat with Mayor Bowen about that yesterday online, and talked through what that might look like and how we might tackle that. See, any other questions on these ones before we jump through to the next slide?
Sorry, Steve, just thinking out loud too, that the water catchment, you know, that was a strong message last week from DIA and the Minister around water catchment areas in our proposals. And I would think that not everyone is up to date with how water catchment areas work here around this table, and I think that's going to be a really important session for us in the future to be having, like when I say in the future, like in the next week or two, to really understand what the water catchment areas are in charge of, what they do, how we bring in those functions into our proposal, because that was a very strong message that needs to be written in there. So I think there's definitely some education around this table on function of those, and I'm sure Pete and Michelle would support that conversation.
Because there's two levels of distinction around them as well in terms of catchments, because there is the ECAM catchment, which is a sort of a people-based process and all that thing, and then there's your wider catchment under your regional plans that say, you know, and it was come through very clearly with the two regional councillors that we had here the other day, that, you know, they are all about protecting certain functions even around our catchment lines and all that sort of thing. But yeah, that we need context about how we will absorb all those functions around a catchment perspective.
Yeah, and I think it extends beyond that too, and it's looking at how the TAs are also delivering their water services too. Yeah, it's going to be quite a lot to be able to knit everything together in a coherent way that's also feasible to deliver. Yeah, and even down to looking at, like probably not for the initial proposal, but looking at system integration, because we all know that system integration can be problematic, and then if you bring in, say, 3 other TAs, that's quite a lot to try and fit together and make it all work, particularly for finance systems. Any other general questions, concerns, statements? Cool. So this is a high-level overview of the Head Start pathway, which is the simplifying local government reform and what it means for TDC. So as we all know, the Head Start pathway was announced on the 5th of May, but simplifying local government goes back to November last year when all those initial discussions started. So we're all pretty familiar with the current timelines. I've put in there possible TDC groupings. That was based on basically neighbours. There's actually, yeah, there is no, I guess, direction from me on that. That was just an example of what a possible wider council could look like. So yeah, the 4th point is probably the key one, that if TDC does join Head Start and our proposal is accepted or approved, I'm not sure what terminology they're using, then we may, all the councils that are included in that may need to do an LTP amendment, which we all know is very expensive. So hopefully we get some relief from central government on that. And yeah, if we opt out, which it's not looking likely that we will do, but if we do, then the backstop process applies, which is where we have less say and, yeah, potentially don't have as much sway at the table when it comes to the conversations.
No question's a silly question, right?
Absolutely
Cool.
not.
So I've just had a few people asking me about, the amalgamation, Head Start, etc. And sorry if I've missed it previously, but just on one of the questions that gets asked quite a lot is, if we amalgamate with another region that has more debt than us, do we take on that debt? So or is that ring fenced? I mean, how does that sort of work in plain English, please?
Yeah.
Too early to say?
Yeah, we don't have the detail
Don't know?
on that yet.
Okay.
Yeah, and that would be, I guess, when you look at how we've set up the water organisation, it's about your committee understanding what's coming in, how it's apportioned, whether there's price harmonisation, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
But the simple debt should actually correspond to an asset. So therefore, that debt should follow that asset. So say we borrow some money for the theatre over there, well then there has to be a conversation about who benefits from that theatre. Where do the rates come from? Same with, I presume if you went up to Ashburton, I presume they got the same thing with their, bigger swimming pool. But you've also got to then start thinking longer term. At what point does that start merging?
That's another question. So with that timetable there, do you expect that Timaru District Council would, I guess trying to get my question out is about the October 2028, is a sort of restructure within TDC going to happen before that? I know that's when the elections are. Do you anticipate there'll be something before that date?
I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
So it may or may not. But
It's not like you're just going to have the election and then suddenly everything's going to change, or is that how it might happen?
That's what we're working towards. So the proposed outline is due, what date? 9th of August. And then and so if the government then goes, yep, we like that, they'll say go away and do more work. And you have until May 2027. But then from there, that's your next green light. And you have to have it implemented, ready to go for that 2028 date. So that is what everyone worked to.
So if the Cabinet approves, then you've got a transition plan. So that transition plan would have to be developed. And that transition plan takes time. So effectively, it would take 1 to 2 years to actually get the thing done properly, if you do it properly. But the governors will be different. The governors will be the new council.
We're in a perfect storm because we're in an election year. If this wasn't an election year, we'd get a lot more detail around this. We'd actually probably have a direction of travel with a lot of whole points and things that would tell us what we need to do that relates to this, but we're not going to hear anything till after the election of real substance around this. We've got a template with some things to do, but the detail you're talking about is not going to be available till after then, I'd say.
And the other thing that's got to be thought about is October 28 is partway through a financial year. So that has to be thought through, even that.
I think Mayor Nigel had himself unmuted there for a minute. Have you got something you'd like to add?
Oh yeah, look, it's not insurmountable. I think we'll have some direction by September, and then if the other parties are like-minded and want to work with us, then we can start transitioning early. I mean, there's things that sit in behind that around, if we've got staff roles, let's start working across boundary early. So yeah, I think once we get that general direction, probably post-election we'll be all good to go.
Excuse me. Is there any suggestion, it sounds like there's a lot of work going into this, is there any suggestion that the King or the Crown's going to be paying for a chunk of it?
We haven't had any offer of any funding towards this process yet.
Are you talking about LTP or Head Start?
Both.
Oh. There was talk of that last week, and me and Nigel will So from the September, the DIA, or this new Ministry of Everything, I've decided that's what they're called. They're not called that. They are saying there will be some support. It was very small in the document.
Oh, can you click the screen, Megan? Can you click the screen? Thanks. Cool, so system improvements bill, this is the one that I am keeping a close eye on, because obviously all of the changes to clauses in the LGA that directly affect the LTP change how we need to time things, make things work together. Yeah. So as we've talked about, the most recent proactive release on all of this was the groups of activities. I've done some work to show what activities we have sitting where in slides further along and what we need to do to change them. Yeah, they're proposed to be set out in secondary legislation or regulated. Currently, the two remaining groups in the mandatory groups of activities are roading and footpaths and flood protection and control works. Regional councils, in our case, ECAN, look after the flood protection and control works, and we look after roading and footpaths. That's all proposed to change, and with them sitting outside primary legislation, that means that the regulated groups can be changed slightly easier by central government, which could be beneficial and could be problematic moving forward. Any questions on system improvements? Anyone would like to have an offline discussion about system improvements? Happy to help.
Although the interesting thing is on the right, the 8, we're structured pretty similar to that at the moment. So, you know, you've got Susie, Andrew, Paul, Stephen, and the two Mikes, and Andrew. So, and some of that other stuff sitting in amongst our CCO and Andrew. So it's pretty well sorted there.
When you take a look at the Cabinet's proactive release, though, and what sits, more of the detail that sits underneath that, but the point of this, though, points to another priority, of course, which we haven't talked about yet, which is the benchmarking, because across the other councils, it's not always as clear-cut, and there might be one from one of these activities that sits with another activity. So this aligns with the plan to be able to compare identical activities across all new authorities to benchmark performance and results and the likes, to further support also some of this rates capping as well, so we can say this is what's being delivered in this council and in this council, this is what it is costing here, this is what it should be costing, this is an average of costing. So it all ties into other stuff too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say if you read between the lines, because in some areas it's pretty clear that central government do want to be able to compare councils easier, and the easiest way to do that is to make sure that all of the LTPs are structured in the same way, we all have the same performance measures. Yeah, it's pretty clear where it's heading. Yeah.
About that number 8, I mean, it's other. Is that what's come through the proposals from the government, or is that your grouping to just sort of group everything else?
No, so those 8 groups are as described.
As described?
Yeah.
So the et cetera is whatever else. It's just, I sort of thought, oh, well, they'd just throw anything else into that last one.
Yeah, there were a couple of odd ones I thought in there. They've put communications and marketing in there, but I find that one a little bit confusing. Maybe it'll make more sense with more detail. But to me, public information and transparency and accountability to the community, I fail to see how communication sits in other. There may be method to the madness, we just don't know yet until we get that exposure draft. Any other questions on System Improvements Bill? Cool. So this is at a high level mapping out what needs to consolidate, rename, extract or no change. So roading and footpaths under the proposed groups and tying in with simplifying local government, the roading and transport group will absorb public transport services. There is also potentially the airport, because that doesn't sit anywhere in the current detail that we've got. Not sure where we'll put that. Could sit in community, could sit in roading, because it's a road. That's real basic brain stuff, but yeah. Waste management and minimisation, very minimal change to that group, so that one's quite easy from our perspective. So the current community services group, the two activities we'd pull out of there to put into adaptation and emergency management are climate and emergency management. So that one's pretty straightforward. Noting that also another regional council activity, flood protection and control works, also sits in there. So coming out of one of Mr. Cooper's groups, District Planning and Environmental Services, the way I describe the Public Regulatory Services proposed group is the doing group versus the district plan, which sits in the proposed governance group. So there's the planning group and the doing group. Yeah.
Sorry, don't get you.
So if you look at governance, planning and reporting, the proposed group on the right in blue, the district and regional plans now sit in there.
I thought you were talking about the purple one.
Yeah, so I refer to my reference in public regulatory as your compliance, your enforcement, anything to do with the doing versus the planning, which moves into that other group. So that's an interesting split. A lot of democracy and corporate moves straight over. A lot of rec and leisure and community out of those two current groups will move into community and rec, which is helpful. Parks and reserves becomes its own group. So if that comes to fruition, we'll have a bit of work to do to get them up to speed to include them in the infrastructure strategy. Because as we all know, any mandatory group with significant assets then must be reflected in the infrastructure strategy. Then we've got a mixture of some of the activities currently in community services and corporate moving into the other group. And then stormwater, wastewater and water supply, there's no change because they are still separate and are covered under water services strategy.
Can I asked, I know there's still a lot to work through in the stormwater space regarding the Water Services Organisation. How does that fit within this context? I know it's listed as an activity under one of these 8 that government said as being one of those 8. How can it not sit there if we've determined that it will otherwise, of what we're hearing, we'd planned for it to stay with our road and LTU, basically, and interacting with others, not being part of the WSO? Is this saying it now must be?
Number
9. It's number 9. But it's got to sit under that now. It doesn't fit into any of these others, does it?
Because if a council had it still in-house, water, wastewater and stormwater is ring-fenced.
Yeah.
And it is also subject to ComCom and Te Mata ROI. So it would be number 9. doesn't fit into any of the other 8.
No, so, so what we've
It
planned,
can't sit.
it can't sit
It can't
in-house.
sit in the groups, no,
No.
because it's under the Local Government Water Services Act now, so it's completely separate.
Yeah.
So although we may deliver some of the services in-house, it is not a mandatory group of activities in the Local Government Act. Yeah, and it also is not in the LTP.
So from a day-to-day functional perspective, it will be sitting in its own, essentially its own ring-fenced company within our current system, but it will be ring-fenced. So it's a bit like downlands. We have TDC, we have downlands, and then we'll have a stormwater, because that forms part of regulatory reporting. So it comes out of council. Yep.
So I was talking to somebody in Selwyn the other day, and they said the stormwater was being picked up under the WSO. It's going to be absorbed. So we're not looking at that, or have I got the wrong end of the stick there?
We're doing some work on that now to be able to bring a paper to both councils with a definitive decision on whether it stays or goes or how it's managed.
Inextricably linked. I mean, I think the issue was that nobody wanted to keep using that filthy combination of words, 3 waters, because it has a political connotation to it, and said, let's just go for 2, and the other one will happily connect later on. I think, I may be wrong.
So council has consistently left stormwater out. This council has consistently left it in-house, but we're questioning that so we can get a paper back to you to say, make a really informed decision, because at the moment I don't think it was informed.
Yeah, so there is a lot of work going on at the moment with stormwater assets, where they sit, what they look like, how, ensuring that everyone's of the correct understanding of where the assets sit as a roading asset versus a stormwater asset. There was still some confusion internally about what the legislation, how it split it. That's being worked through at the moment, and yeah, the knowledge is improving on where things need to sit. There is quite a lot to unpack with regards to a lot of the natural swales in parks and reserves and how we quantify those. So yeah, a lot of work going on.
As we've seen, you're going to have to look at Wellington as an example of inundation of stormwater into wastewater, and it's, with climate change and everything that's happening around that's going to happen even more. They need to, they're all part of the one group. So hopefully that would be the wise decision.
Yeah, and there's different ways for the stormwater to be delivered too. Like the water organisation could, for example, look after the reporting requirements with ComCom, and they could look after the water services strategy component, because that technical expertise might actually live in the water organisation versus what's remaining in TDC. So all that's being worked through to look at the moment. Any other questions on that?
I think, just to clarify, so TDHL would fit into this other grouping, do you think?
CCOs are separate from the mandatory groups
okay,
under
so
the legislation. Yeah, so
okay.
we might, I mean, if there was a CCO that was delivering a specific activity or group of activities, then they would feed in through that, whereas TDHL's interests and their nature and scope of activities kind of sits a little bit outside all of these groups. So we need some more detail. That so far the proposal's silent on where CCOs need to sit, but I would imagine based on the current legislation, the CCOs are separate. And there are specific requirements that we must include in the LTP related to CCOs. Good question though, Councillor Thomas.
So the water CCO they're quite specific about that one because of all the legislation, so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, so they will be a section similar to what we already have in here for Venture Timaru and TDHL. So there will be another section for the water organisation in the LTP.
From a group perspective, financially, they come in as a consolidation. So we look at council as a whole, and then we look at the council as a group of activities.
Cool. Actually, before we get into the strategic direction chat, I see my planning manager's sitting in the back, so he can come and give a quick chat about the RM reform and the impacts on LTP.
Oh,
There's a spare seat ready.
So as you know, we've touched on previously, from an RM reform perspective, the government has undertaken to repeal the current Resource Management Act and replace that with 2 new pieces of legislation. Those 2 new pieces of legislation have been through the first reading and are currently in the Select Committee process, with my understanding that they're supposed to be releasing the feedback reports from those Select Committee processes imminently, with the intent very much being that the final reading will occur July, August this year, so prior to the end of the current parliamentary term. It's important to preface my comments with there was lots of feedback provided as part of those formal processes, so it's to some extent crystal ball gazing as to what the final pieces of legislation will look like. But to read the tea leaves, the government's looking to reduce the number of resource consents. The initial headlines when the new legislation released was 40%, moved towards more of a monitoring and compliance type framework, which is viewed as being more effective and efficient. So you do it this way, you're fine, but we'll check on you a bit more. They're looking at reducing the number of planning documents, so consolidating plans into one for each region, with the environment stuff still kind of dealt with at a regional level, but then each council having a specific chapter within those new documents, rather than having to then create a whole document themselves, which gives effect to what all the other higher documents tell you. So also including standardised zoning below it. So I think I've used the analogy before as effectively the government will be telling us from the top down very prescriptively through national direction and policies what you have to do from there, and then they'll be telling us how you do it from the bottom up with their standardised zoning. So it'll limit the ability of councils to have their stamp on the new system, as we'll be kind of sandwiched in the middle with quite smaller sandpits than we're used to playing in, I guess, which will have its benefits from an efficiency and effectiveness perspective, in that we won't be spending decades putting together our own plans and trying to interpret higher level guidance and then apply bespoke rules and zones to meet the direction of our communities, because effectively the government will be giving us the paint by numbers, and we'll be just choosing what colour we put where at a high level from the zoning. That has an impact on what level of service we have to deliver internally, but it also has an impact on the level of information and how we articulate that through to the new processes, so that we can still make sure the documents are delivering on the aspirations of council and our communities, which, as we've been talking about through the Development and Growth Committee work stream, is around having good evidence and data that aligns with our other key documents, which Steph is talking about today, so that when we're saying we need to identify this area to provide for growth, or industrial or residential, that we've got the numbers to support that, so that it can get through the higher level framework and considerations that the government will be putting over it. We'll need to be able to demonstrate how it's been funded, and that aligns with our asset management plans, our infrastructure strategy and our LTP funding modelling. The new legislation has no mention of financial contributions. This council is quite unique in that we rely solely on financial contributions rather than having a development contributions policy. In either instance, the government, as part of a consultation that we submitted on earlier this year, has proposed to get rid of development contributions and include a development levy. That hasn't introduced any legislation into Parliament to direct that, but we're kind of in a unique position where we don't have development contributions at the moment, so we rely on financial contributions which aren't mentioned in the new legislation. So there's a risk that we lose some funding through that. And I guess my view is that the direction of the new legislation and the government is that growth will pay for growth. So as a council, we really need to understand what that means on the ground around providing infrastructure and access to infrastructure, where the public benefit lies in doing that versus the developer paying their contribution from a growth perspective, and how council can influence that, especially with the water CCO being established, which will be a standalone company. So the direction set in these documents becomes quite important to be aligned so that the water CCO has clear direction as they set up and establish as well. Is that kind of what you...
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, sorry, thanks.
And you've just looked after the question Elliot was going to have to answer.
And I actually think we all understood that. So I'm not sure if we're just getting better at understanding it or
You do, because you're the chair of that committee.
Oh,
The difference. I don't quite understand what growth pace for growth really means, and I think that's something we're going to have to grapple with. Because if you're connecting to something that's already there, what does that mean by growth pace for growth? So it does need a lot of thinking.
A question for you, Aaron, and I know this is going to be brought up quite a bit, and it already is all around the country about the point of an LTP in this environment that we're operating in at the moment, and the uncertainty. How much of this, that like what you've explained for us, that we are doing for our spatial planning, our asset management plans and what have you, how much of that forms the LTP work that you think we have to do anyway in order to properly set ourselves up for success in the future on our own or within a group, whether it is referred to as LTP work or not?
So my view is understanding some of those key drivers and demands and how making sure they integrate across all those key supporting documents for an LTP is critical for any council's success moving into the new system. That's very much the direction from the government, is that we want you to be really good at asset management and infrastructure management and providing services for your community. They're kind of, my view is they're directing that becomes effectively one of the core functions. So if we don't have the data or the information or an understanding of how growth's occurring, then there's the potential that council would be left behind, and that, especially when decisions have been made at a different table to this, it becomes quite challenging to maintain that local flavour and voice if we don't understand and haven't engaged with the community and have a really good understanding of, proactive rather than reactive. And I think historically, and we saw it through the district plan review, council's been rather reactive in that the growth's already got to a certain stage, we're starting to blow out into these new areas, we need to do a plan change to try and tidy that up retrospectively, when the shift from the government is no, that needs to be identified and within this framework, so the costs are at a high level now and the funding's at a high level now, and so that when the demand eventuates within that private sector, it's all ready to go, rather than getting caught up in a 2 or 3 year process around trying to go through a lengthy plan change and financial modelling and all that type of stuff. And
The problem we've got is all that needs to be done, but it won't be done in time for this LTP. If you think about it logically, because you've only got less than a year to get this LTP done and out for consultation, and that work that we're doing is 9 months away, to help inform a regional spatial plan, which is potentially 14 months after the legislation's been passed. So we do have a timing issue there. And at the moment, our current LTP has served us well for the first 3 years, but for the next 7 years, it probably didn't serve us well, or maybe it does. So effectively, there is a massive timing issue here.
There is, but you can't not do it.
I understand you've got to do it,
Yep.
but that's great. But this LTP is going to still be lacking evidence and exactly what we're trying to do in terms of demand and growth. I don't think it'll be there in time, but the people might have a different view of that, but as CE, I just don't see it coming together.
Was your question, given what's about to happen to us in terms of all the restructures and everything, is this part of work still valuable and needs to be done and everything because we don't know what the future looks like? If that's what I was thinking, because effectively, regardless of what happens and where the boundaries sit, so you change all the boundaries and everything, where your public, where your population densities and everything are, and all those things, they still become significantly relevant regardless. And so that's they then can be consolidated afterwards. So that has to be done, as opposed to we're sitting here going an LTP from all those other trajectories. What the hell? And so I think that's a key consideration. Yeah. So you're saying you honestly believe that we will not get that work done to a level that's required, or we won't get the work done?
I don't think it will be there to actually fully inform this LTP that we're about to put together. Sure, you can have your asset management plans, but actually that's about the renewals. But in terms of demand and growth, I just can't see how you're going to be able to pull that together to really make a well-informed LTP, because the timing is all wrong. But I can be proved differently to that. And I also think with the simplifying local government, the Head Start one, there is a potential 1 year transition, because that will be 28, 29 where the election happens. So effectively you're well and truly into year 2 of the new LTP. Have I got the numbers right? 27, 28, 28, 29, yep. You only got 1 year left before you do a new LTP. And my thinking is, if I was the Crown, I'd be going, just do your LTPs. For the last year, we'll have an annual plan for that 1 year of your new entity, which will just consolidate whomever you're going with, consolidate that together to an annual plan, then get on with your LTP, your new LTP. So I think the LTP is going to happen, if I think about it logically, because 2 of the 3 years are going to have to be done.
DIA presented as well, and they are looking at a concession though for LTP, so it'll be interesting what gets spat out on that. Yeah.
Period. It means you've got 3 annual plans rather than 3 years of an LTP.
I don't think necessarily matters though. We just need to be focused on what we need in it for Timaru district, and then the amalgamation will come later, and then integration. I think that's why we need the growth in there no matter what. It's our one opportunity.
Aaron, what do you think about getting enough evidence to inform the LTP?
I think you're correct that the evidential base will be, I think, enough to set the high-level direction within those documents around how growth is going to be approached and what level of demand and growth change we're being anticipated. But I fully agree there's not going to be the time to necessarily implement all the mechanisms that we need to implement to realise that through this LTP. So that's changing your financial contribution, potentially in development contribution policy and all that type of stuff. And we're going to run out of time really quickly, and there's still so much uncertainty around the spatial planning legislation and the like. So it's about, I guess, identifying some of the big moves and some of the high-level anticipated costs and the like, but it's not going to be broken down to a spreadsheet level around enough, or it's about implementing that through whatever the legislative process is. It's probably more foreshadowing some of that and the additional detailed work, but I guess having a shift towards having any growth identified within these other documents is still a big shift for this council, which currently doesn't really have those sections. So it's still that in itself is a major shift and a step in the right direction.
And I think that's the point. It's the shifting of what informs our plans to a new model, regardless of where the various legislation lands. And where we are, even within that journey, it is changing to evidencing our decisions for our, through our asset management plans and what have you, just to make better informed decisions which way we are going to go. And that's a step change for this council, and regardless of where everything lands, that to me is the positive thing, and that we're starting that work now.
Yeah, I would just probably add a couple of things. So Section 1013 of the Local Government Act is your funding needs analysis. You need to be able to evidence the funding you are using for specific activities and why you need that money, and then looking at public-private benefit. So regardless of where we get to with the best information we have at the time, that will then inform the revenue and financing policies. So that is still a legislative requirement. We're absolutely on a pathway with asset management planning. It is one of my favourite topics. And that's why when Elliot, Aaron and I started looking at all this reform stuff, towards the end of last year, that's why we kicked off and prioritised the demand and growth assumptions work that we have got rationale undertaking, because we knew it was going to be critical. We have been silent on growth, or where we do reference growth in the LTP, it is not consistent across the document because we don't have a set of assumptions that we're applying across everything. So that is going to improve our forecasting for sure. Of our groups, Three Waters aside, because we're just not going to talk about them right now, roading and footpaths asset management planning is good. It's been good for ages because they need it to be good to help with their NLTP funding. Vertical assets is probably our biggest risk. That's where we've got the most unknowns. We know where everything is, but the condition assessments on those verticals, we need to do a lot of evidence gathering. So that's a big risk. But yeah, we're on a pathway with asset management like most councils. Most councils have stuck to the mandatory groups of activities because that is what was required in the infrastructure strategy. Now, with the proposed groups, that is going to change the scope. Therefore, a lot of councils across the country are going to have to significantly improve their approach to asset management planning.
The tricky part with growth, demand and growth, is actually the majority of the capital goes into water. And that's going to be out of our hands. That'll be the water entity having to work out. Yeah, because the roading is actually, of those three, the roading is easier, I think. Whereas the water is a lot more complex, as far as I can see, in understanding what demand is there. That's what I can see. And that's sitting outside into a different entity now. While we can actually give them some views on our letter of expectations, but boy, they've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, true. But we should know our demands and what's going on. But it's linked to growth. But we always have headroom, and that what's happening at Claremont goes a massive way to, because it's, our biggest problem is impediment to have the amount of water correctly treated and all that sort of stuff. So all that there is going to actually give us a lot more headroom and everything. So I thought we would have been able to do our water in terms of our growth and our expectations, that we're doing a great job there in meeting those demands.
Yeah, so in their asset management plan updates that they're doing at the moment, the key focus is on their demand and capacity constraints, because under the Act, the purpose is still to meet current and future needs of the community, regardless of the fact that the Local Government Water Services Act sits outside that now. If you look at the district as a whole and how it operates, those water and wastewater assets and services help the district to run, coherent planning for the whole district. So, yeah.
No, have a good look at Washdyke on the maps of what infrastructure is there and what potentially is missing if you want to keep developing Washdyke for industry. Someone's going to have to do that work and work out where does it go. Our FTAs, the FTAs will need significant waste or sewage and water infrastructure put in place, and that's significant. So effectively there's a big job to be done.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
So that brings up that point of influence within council over our water entities, about our economic drivers and how we influence them and what influence they're going to have, as to, no, we don't see that in our budget for this projection, and they're all hand in glove stuff around economics and our services that drive growth and everything. So that's going to be an interesting proposition.
Yeah, with water and wastewater sitting now under the regulations with ComCom, there is that tension between what used to be the political desire and, the public benefit, private benefit split, whereas now that's gone under ComCom. But there is, I guess, guardrails around having it in ComCom, in the sense that there is no political element anymore to the decision-making of what, demands and constraints the community has, and how that organisation and those activities are going to meet the needs of the community. Yeah. So that, yeah. Yeah. So, any other tricky questions for Aaron?
Where it says system improvements bill,
Yep.
the 17A cost effectiveness reviews repealed.
Yep.
What form do you think that's going to take, and is it ineffective? The 17A, is it ineffective at the moment? How are they going? How are they going to improve it?
I've always been intrigued. I've only been in council a few years. The 17A reviews, it says cost-effective reviews. Now, we've had 17A reviews where we don't even talk about $1. And I've always been intrigued by them, actually. I think we've still got to do cost-effective reviews, but you don't need a 17A. It's actually for council to get those things reviewed themselves. That's what I think. You've really got to understand how cost-effective are your services, and that should be, we should still keep doing them, but we need to do them probably more cost-effectively themselves and really understand our own gigs.
Can I make a comment on that? That's why we have senior leaders. They should be constantly reviewing their business units.
Any other tricky questions for Aaron before we let him escape?
Aaron, can you just remind us of the timeline of the current district plan appeal process, and when that might actually land, and if we're going to get any value out of the tens of millions we've spent on that?
Yeah, so I've got a paper coming to council meeting on Tuesday with an update, but a real brief summary, the appeal period's now closed. We received 12 appeals. Broadly speaking, some of them are quite confined, so working through the detail of that now, we're now in a period where other parties can join the appeals. So that will have an impact on the strategy that can be taken in addressing the appeals. But yeah, I would preface it, I think there's no appeals that I'm aware of that have challenged any of the urban type stuff. So and we're still working through the assessment, but for all intents and purposes, large tracts of that proposed plan now fully operative. Under the eye of the law, so that's removed any constraints from your having to assess two plans as part of your two-lot infill subdivision in an urban environment. So, yeah, a lot of the appeals are quite confined. They're from the bigger players within the industry, your Transpowers, your NZTAs, your Fonterras. There's very few what I'd describe as local on-the-site appeals. And they're on our website. Yeah.
Yes, you may leave. So now we'll move on to a bit more of an informal discussion on the strategic direction. Obviously, we're not making any decisions today. It's just to have an open discussion about how we think the current vision, values and roles and strategic priorities sit in the scope of all this reform that's going on. And then we'll look to unpack these further in the planned workshops next month. So, kicking off, the current vision statement is where people, place and business prosper within a healthy, adaptable and regenerative environment. So considering the current purpose of local government to enable democratic local decision-making and action by and on behalf of communities and to promote social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of communities in the present and for the future. And then looking at the updated purpose is detailed in the System Improvements Amendment Bill. Does anyone have any immediate thoughts on how that vision sits across the proposed amended purpose of local government?
I think we're wasting your time, other than saying is it still relevant to where we sit today, without even trying to extend the potential for around all the changes. The purpose of local government, this central government has removed the, other than economics, has removed social, environmental and cultural well-beings out of our purview anyway, hoping that economics would cover everything. We could spend a lot of time going around the table here and come up with, you know, like we do, could spend time and money on coming up with a really good vision, but it just sits on a bit of paper. I'm not sure if it will add a lot of value today. I might be wrong.
Any other thoughts?
To me, the LTP vision for 2027 to 37 should be Section 10 as amended. And everything should centre around that.
Okay.
I've never been comfortable with this vision. I feel like last time round there was no ownership of it around the table. It was, this is what we've got, and we didn't really discuss it or think about it, and so it lacks a bit of ownership. But I tend to agree with Councillor Burt in what is kind of the point when we don't even know what we're going to look like in 3 years. But in saying that, I think you could cut the second half of that vision off and just have where people, place and business prosper, because place is environment.
Yeah. Okay. No other thoughts on vision? That's all right, we can move on. Like I say, this is just an open floor discussion. We're not deciding anything today. We don't have to spend too much time on it. It's just to figure out where everyone's heads are at with how it looks in the current and the likely coming environment.
It does concern me though, because if you don't have that vision, it is really, what should guide your long-term plan. And if you don't have a vision of what you want the community to be and what it looks like, where are you heading with your plan? Where are we heading with our plan? So I do think we need to land on a vision, and whether that's just keep the one we've got or do we want something different? And I'm trying to think how you get a vision that works for our community, that will still work for our community in the wider context of what it might look like going forward, but it probably needs a bit of thought.
Yeah.
Can I chip in from the cheap seats?
Sure.
I think I'd say the vision is still important. The purpose is almost a servant of that vision. It's the mechanism that you use to get to where you want things to go to. And it acts as a sort of a good initial sift for staff as well, because they can say, well, we've got this project. Does it point us towards that vision or after it? And that's that really initial first step that they can take before they even sort of spend money on bringing an idea to come up to you. So I'd say you still need that kind of North Star to guide you to some degree.
I just want to say something with I think it was discussed when we had a workshop here, we talked about vision. I just forget which workshop it was. And I made a statement of a vision. And I'm not suggesting or promoting that at the moment, because this is not a time for decision making, as you indicated. But I'm very clear about one thing. An organisation needs a vision. There's a good book that says without a vision, people perish. The reality of life is in a business, how big or small it may be, you need to have a vision to work off. Without a vision, I can never understand how an organisation can decide what they should do or they shouldn't do when ideas come up. There's some fantastic ideas out in the community, and from individual people. But if you don't have a vision, how can you determine which are the ones you do and the ones you don't? So I'm strong with the view, we need a vision, and let's have a chat about that at the appropriate time about what that should be. I'm not convinced that's the one, but hey, I'm not trying to knock that down. I'm just saying I don't think that is the vision for the future. But of course, we're going to be a different organisation soon, so other people will have an input into that vision as well, not just us.
And I think what Councillor Pye said, where people, place and business prosper is great, but we are to become a unitary, so therefore maybe as where people, environment and business prosper. So if we are unitary, we do have to put that environmental lens over everything we do.
Yeah, so as Councillor Wilson mentioned, the purpose of the vision is to be able to, when you're considering proposals, to look at your vision, your values and roles, and your strategic priorities, because they all need to be coherent together at those three layers. And then go, okay, cool, so we've decided on these priorities that enable this value in council's role and the community's role, and this is the ultimate direction of travel. How do these proposals fit with what those layers are? How do we benchmark things? How do we can have trade-off discussions about what fits better with where the community wants to go? I do think, and I know, that it is important to have those three layers. What council decides to, socialise with the community and get the community's feedback on, and the timing of that, we potentially need to come up with a draft socialise it, and then revisit it when more of this reform lands too, because that could significantly reshape what the overall vision is for the community. Ideally, in a normal LTP cycle, you would do this first, everything would link to it, and you'd be good. We're potentially not going to have this luxury this time round with all the moving parts and changes on the horizon. So that's cool. So looking at our values and role within the community, so that is the organisation as a whole, elected members, officers. So the current ones that were developed in 2021 to 2031 LTP were inclusive leadership, cultural caretakers and transition navigators. In the words of Councillor Pye, does anyone have an allergic reaction to any of those headings?
See, we had some foresight with the last one.
So I think like this needs a bit of thought, and it's, without knowing the content of the workshop today until late last night, we just haven't had that thinking space.
These ones are potentially a little bit easier to tie into the current environment. So one of the strategic priorities was resilient infrastructure, and the focus area or the priority for the 24-34 LTP was invest for the future. Looking at the current environment, I don't think resilient or fit for purpose or something along those lines regarding infrastructure would fall off as a strategic priority, but keen to hear any thoughts.
Is this just this council putting this together, or have you looked at somebody else, the nationwide, who's, have they put other little ditties in there?
Yes.
You followed?
Yep, so all councils in the LTPs have a vision, their values and role, and the strategic priorities. They're not a specific, they're not a legislative requirement. However, it makes it a lot easier to tie your community outcomes, which is still a legislative requirement, to what you fund and how you fund it and what you deliver with regards to your services. Yep. Yeah.
These things are a snapshot in time, reflecting who's around the table, reflecting what we know and understand of our circumstances economically, future-wise, infrastructure-wise and everything like that. So they can be changed, they can be, whatever. You could make this one fit exactly what the circumstances are today with the knowledge we have. So it's
Generally, depending on when councils develop them, they can also reflect the legislation at that time, which reflects whoever is in government at the time too. Hence why some of these strategic priorities and perhaps some of the words used in the vision don't feel like they ring true today, because government policy statements conflict with some of those priorities. So that's also another thing to consider as well when reviewing these is, yes, give effect to the legislation, but it's actually more about the district and what the district needs. Cool, so just flicking through those other priorities, they're all listed in the LTP.
Come up with anything? Sorry.
No, I use Claude for a lot of things, but this is not one of them. Cool, so based on what I'm hearing around the table is we actually need to have quite a significant look at the vision, values and roles and strategic direction in the workshop that is planned for next month.
But these goals, are they linked to the 8? How do you link those? So I can understand a vision being very punchy and short.
Yep.
Then I would have thought the goals would be linked to those 8 functions that we do.
Yeah.
Which to the right is more about, networks, public transport, waste and so forth, which is some of the 8.
Yeah, the risk you run with that though is, like I said, if you link it too prescriptively to the current legislation, particularly if these groups are sitting in secondary, not primary, and able to be changed, then you run the risk of being in conflict with legislation should the government change.
I'm worried, Steph, that we have another workshop and we have the same level of conversation or lack of input. And so I really feel like somebody needs to do a bit of work before that workshop, going, here are some options, here are some values, this might be what's missing given the new legislation, here's some goals that link to the 8 priorities. What do you think? Because otherwise we're not going to be able to draft vision, values and goals in a workshop by a committee of 10.
Yeah.
I think we'd be a little bit wary of the tail wagging the dog in that regard, though.
I said someone. We can decide whether that's the dog or the tail.
Yeah, so the plan is, and I've already had a conversation with Mayor Bowen about this too, is to get an external facilitator to come in and facilitate that. I don't think that should be led by an officer. I think it needs to be someone completely independent that can challenge views from both sides. So we've got a short list of facilitators. That's why I kind of wanted to have this discussion today at a high level to figure out who's going to be best to lead that discussion and what the scope of the review needs to be as well. Cool, and this is where you all get a break from me and I stop talking and pass to the CFO.
Thanks, Steph. So I've just got
about depreciation, just because a lot of discussion, a lot of times depreciation is mentioned, and the fact that we are or are not budgeting or funding depreciation, and then I hear other councils are or are not. Steph, is it a requirement in our legislation, the financial part of the legislation, to fund depreciation? And if so, why hasn't it been enforced? If it isn't, well, that's fair enough. Yeah.
So I'll answer that. So we do have to, when the auditors look at our LTP, they will do a review of whether we are financially sustainable going forward, and they'll give you probably 3 years max to actually, if you are in deficit, and then they'll be looking for a process of getting back to a break even. Now, depreciation is it's a requirement in my book for accounting, for GAAP, generally accounting principles. Yeah, and which is now gone, but anyway, that's not the point. But you should be booking that depreciation. And booking that depreciation then gives you either a profit or loss. Now, what's happening is the depreciation gets booked in your profit and loss, but from other processes like vested assets, you can look like you're breaking even because of those vested assets. Now, what I've been aiming at is saying that depreciation should be 100% funded whereas other councils, while they book it, they don't 100% fund it through the rates. Does that make sense? When do you know? You take out the non-cash items out of your profit and loss, and you see if you're break even or not. It's as simple as that. No, we do. Oh, other councils, they'll know exactly where they're at. But if they have vested assets, they can actually look like they're breaking even, and they potentially aren't. Yeah.
So just to be clear, though, what you're saying is that is not an absolute requirement to fund depreciation. And I know in your view, I meant in the legislation.
No, it's just prudent too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So effectively, some councils look at their ability, so the differences between the ability to rate to pay for things and when the tip-off comes and the trade-off is the amount of debt you require to meet your responsibilities around, say, infrastructural deficit and everything like that. So what they're saying, in very simple layman terms, is that, well, we can rate for a lot of this stuff, so we'll only depreciate to this level.
So, no, not quite. So
effectively, if you are not funding your depreciation, you'll be downgrading your asset base because you will not have the cash to replace it. Or if you decide not to depreciate, then you're going to have to borrow to replace it.
So
now, typically, if you are funding your depreciation, your depreciation won't keep up with the replacements. You will still probably have to borrow a percentage of it. So it's really critical that you do it.
some councils actually choose to only fund their renewal program, for example. So they might decide, well, actually, this is our renewal program this year, so actually, irrespective of the depreciation that we're charging from a cost perspective, this is all we're going to collect from funding to actually pay for. So they might have a program of $25 million. So they might only choose to fund $25 million, but yet their depreciation might be $40 million.
But that also won't work in a rate cap environment where it's lumpy. So you need consistency in depreciation.
Correct.
And there's a strong correlation where those that aren't focused on depreciation are under investing in renewal.
Your total depreciation actually is your renewals. If your depreciation is done well, it will equal your renewals over the long term. And if you choose to actually underfund it, at some point, you would have to borrow more for not just the demand that's going to come at you or the growth, it will also have to be borrowed for the renewals, which shouldn't happen. And also what you are then doing is you're kicking the can down the road to future generations.
Okay. Megan, can you put up the PDF on the screen? Okay, yeah, that's cool. So in front of you, and we'll bring it up on the screen in a minute, is essentially a very high-level a 10-year forecast. This hasn't taken into consideration any of the reform. It literally is best, scenario ultimately will change. So it was just to give you some indication of what we might look like based on a few assumptions. So what is currently in front of you is basically, if we were to break even from an operating perspective, so therefore funding all of our current depreciation, essentially just wait until Megan gets it sorted. This is excluding water because our long-term plan will not have water in here. So I've also made the assumption for the first 3 years of our LTP that we will do a shared service arrangement with the water organisation. So here we've got our our annual plan for 25-26, and then we've got our adjusted annual plan for 26-27, based on the current information that we sent out for engagement with the community. A 9% overall rates rise, but 3.5% is excluding water. So in the 27-28 year, to break even, if we kept everything status quo this year, added on some percentages, we could be looking at a break even of 2.1%, making the assumption that we are going to charge the water organisation $3.2 million in revenue. So for the first 3 years, we're charging the water organisation revenue, which means that we could potentially keep our rates at around the 2.0 to 2.3% average increase. However, in that next year, once that 3 years falls off, for us to actually break even, we would need to increase our rates by 7.1%. And then after that big hit, we've built our base from a rates perspective and therefore can bring the rates increases back down. So a couple of things to note here is actually we hit rates capping, so that 7.1 would not be allowed. So this is a scenario that actually, to break even would be great, but it wouldn't work.
But Andrea,
But you could smooth that out, Andrea, as well, couldn't you?
Yes, in the next slide.
Yep.
Next slide.
it doesn't look to me like in here you've made an adjustment for personnel. So you've got personnel the same, and we're going to charge the water services organisation. And then when we stop charging them, we're not going to carry all the same people, surely.
Once again, the assumption I have gradually pulled down some of the staff, but until such time, not all of what we charge the water organisation is people related. There is rent, there is IT services, there is a combination of things that make up that charge to them.
But sorry, what I can't see in here is when all of the water people go to the water services organisation.
They're already out.
But
so right from day one, they've gone completely.
And you've taken it out of the 25-26 year as well?
Yes.
Okay, beg your pardon.
Yes. So essentially this is just council only, making the assumption that the operating staff have gone, and this is the back office shared service function, whatever that may look like. Yeah.
It's very sensitive to your percentages. So, 2% for salaries, would you achieve that? So it's sensitive to that. But it is running a bit of it is break even from a point of view. So I think what this is demonstrating, you can live within that cap. That's all it's demonstrating, I think. Except for the 1 year. And the 1 year is then, it might depends on how quickly and how much of those costs you can really get out.
What are the assumptions around the vested assets? I'm just trying to understand that.
So the assumptions around the vested assets are what we currently, from a roading perspective, actually getting, and then there's just a slight percentage increase. So it was based on our LTP numbers that we had in 24-34. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But these are excluded. So you'll see a blue line and a green line. The green line is your operating surplus. So that excludes your vested assets, and then you've got your accounting surplus, which is essentially the value of your vested assets.
Andrea, do we know if the 4%, which we're aiming for, is that a goal or an absolute?
At this point, it's an unknown. It's these percentages here on slide, page 2 are essentially percentages that could be, from my perspective, reasonable. That's not to say that that's what they're going to be. This is just a high-level example of what it might look like and how we might get to within the rates capping of less than 4%. So the second slide essentially has smoothed out that loss of income in year, it'll be 1/4 of the LTP. So it's essentially said, well, okay, how can we reduce that? So we could run some operating surpluses in the first 3 years of the LTP, anticipating that loss of about $3.5 million in year 4. And then what does that look like? So you can see that that's actually, this model here is actually allowed for a surplus, an operating surplus, which throughout the life of the plan could actually then allow you to repay debt as you go.
That's the other piece on depreciation I didn't remember to tell you, is that if you're fully funding depreciation from cash and you don't use it all on CapEx, you can help to repay debt. Because how else are you going to repay debt?
I'm just slightly concerned at what we're trying to tell ourselves here. Not you, Andrea, us as a table, in that it feels to me like we're going, don't worry, we can just carry on doing what we're doing and we'll meet the rates capping. Whereas I have a different view of, we still need to look at every single thing we're doing and still, 4% shouldn't be a target. We still need to look at how we can, A, generate more income or realise assets to repay debt. And there's still a lot of work to do. I just feel like we're almost telling ourselves there's nothing to do.
What I think this is saying is that we've got a good foundation now, of which to springboard to actually ensure we stay within a rates cap. So that's all we're saying. Because these percentages that Andrew's got here, 2% or 1% or 0.5%, they're not real. They will be different. Yeah.
And what happens if interest rates go to 8%?
Yeah, like other expenses are 2, 1.9, 1.9. Well, we know damn well inflation's running at around 3 or 4.
Okay.
So we've got to actually make sure that we still keep doing that, what you're talking about, because these will be wrong.
Yes,
All it's telling us is that we can certainly get there.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah, so all of these percentages were hypothetical percentages at a very high level, because until such time that we know a bit more detail, then there's the opportunity for this to change. Yeah. So it was just to sort of give you a visual picture of what, it could look like.
So,
Look like?
Quite good.
Good.
Well, your surplus will increase.
Yep.
And if you don't change anything else, then you'll be on the up and up.
But technically, rates are not a vehicle to produce surplus. It has to be
correct,
absolutely and utterly
prudent,
looked at, and yeah. So you can't go. It'd be really good to have. So that's what makes it difficult.
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah.
But when you look at it though, you've got to take the vested assets out. Okay, so when you see a surplus of 2 million and you've got vested assets of 2 million, you're only at break even.
But in this scenario, if you look at your operating surplus deficit, that is your surplus deficit excluding vested assets.
So based on that conversation though, how do we ever repay debt? Because we need those surpluses or asset sales to repay debt.
Because your capital is lumpy, so there will be periods where you actually are booking depreciation, but that component of the depreciation is not required because the asset is 10 years out, and that money should be used to repay debt.
So it would generate a cash surplus that you could then use to repay.
So that's the only way you can repay debt, is to make sure you are funding your depreciation.
And your capital program over the period of the 10 years is less than your depreciation.
No, it'll be equal to. But you're still going to have to borrow at some point.
Yeah.
So a loan is a tool, and you've just got to make sure that you're keeping it up and down in line with what the asset base looks like.
It also depends on the type of your capital as well. Like, so if you don't build anything new and shiny, then technically you shouldn't have to borrow for anything. So at the moment we're doing the theatre, stadium, museum, but actually is there anything else in the next 10 years that actually you would be borrowing to build outside of renewals?
But if we have a renewal program of, and I'm making figures up here, 20 million for next year, we don't have that 20 million sitting in a depreciation account. You know, we'd have to still go and borrow that 20 million, wouldn't we?
No, because you're collecting your rates cash. So your rates when people pay their bills generates that cash to pay the suppliers to build the new or renew the asset.
So if you take water out, ours is 23 million of depreciation. If we set a capital plan of 10, well then there's 13 million cash that can repay debt. And I think the trick's going to be making sure, but the worst thing we've got though is that likes of the theatre, it's a building that we're not revaluing, so the depreciation on all these buildings is below what we should be getting. So effectively, when you go to do a building up like this, you're going to have to borrow.
Yeah,
because we're not depreciating them at the right rate.
I agree, and I still think over the tenure of the plan, if your depreciation and your capital plan are equal over the 10 years, I know there'll be lumps, we're not repaying debt.
Can I make a comment? I think you've misguided us so slightly in the fact that you can't rate to pay down debt, so that is technically incorrect. Otherwise, you would never be able to pay down debt. And then the other element is other revenue sitting out there, which we're addressing, which can be used for those purposes. So yes, I get the depreciation renewal argument, renewal less than depreciation, etc. However, you can rate to pay down debt.
So in the majority of years, your capital plan should be lower than your depreciation. And that is helping to repay debt. And then you'll get the odd year where you have to do something big and then you'll borrow again. And that's how you keep your cost of capital down.
But to your point, if we're not fully depreciating buildings, that's never going to work.
So Mayor Bowen's right in the fact that we can plan to make a surplus as long as it's prudent, and within our revenue and financing policy, we can actually set that so that part of that is, we will, on average, rate an additional $1 million per year for the purpose of repayment of debt. So you can actually make that call in your policy. As long as it's not, we can't say, well, okay, we're going to be 4% every year, because, that might not necessarily be prudent from a financial sustainability perspective.
Best we can hope for is $1 million or $2 million a year will be here for 200 years.
That, either that or sky-high your rates. And that's not
Can't do that anymore.
correct, yeah.
But if you think about the next 10 years, take water out, right? Roading will probably be around 7 million mark, and then the rest of it is for buildings and parks and so forth. You actually should be able to start repaying, because most of the buildings are going to be in relatively fine order. Well, yes, but you think about it, theatre's been done, so it's in good nick. The museum brand new. This building here might need a little bit, but not a lot. We know the issues with the library. Yes, we will have to replace the roof again, but that's not big in the scheme of things. So effectively, the one out at Geraldine, the service centre, is in pretty good shape. The theatre is an issue we're going to have to grapple with at some point. So actually, we're not in too bad a shape.
So essentially that was all I wanted to sort of highlight, is sort of give you like I say, a visual of what it could look like, knowing that there is a lot of changes between now and when we set the LTP, but it was just to, put something out there.
I guess that's also just, I know based on lots of assumptions, but if you looked at page 1 and said, oh, great, we can keep our rates at so much next year and the year after, whatever sort of thing. Yes, we're going to have a lumpy time when it gets to 7%, but we need to start that smoothing, immediately, or...
Because essentially in that particular year is when rates capping is in. So, we suddenly lose some income, we're in trouble.
Yeah. However, if we do head start really well, all the councils should be able to make some gains, all of them. There should be millions in it that we should be able to pull back.
Is that from efficiency? Is it? Yeah.
Efficiencies and reductions of, yeah.
Cool, so what we might do now is we'll just jump into the general public discussion and next steps. Obviously, we're not entirely sure on what the details of the next steps are, because every week we get a new update, release, announcement. The plan is constantly changing, but at the moment we are managing it purely because we are focusing on the evidence base and less about the integration at this stage. So work internally that has kicked off is the unpacking of all the services that the activities actually deliver to the community. We've started building service registers and identifying which other units contribute to those services that the lead business unit undertakes. There's still a lot of work to do in there to get it all coherent and create the master service catalogue. There's still some gaps missing with activities that CCOs deliver on our behalf. So we need to integrate all of those into one coherent space and then look to procure the external to come in and help do the investigation and have, once again, that independent view, which we think is really important for that process. That will then start to build the activity management plans. I am doing a dummy run with Mike Wrigley on Friday with the current template and his activities, because we know his services pretty well. The key missing bits for his activity management plan will be the costs associated with renewals of components of his building. the costing will be a little bit difficult until we can get some modelling underway. But yeah, Mike is a willing participant in being my test dummy, so I'm going to make use of that, and I've got him held hostage on Friday. When information lands with the exposure draft with the system improvements bill and we've got some more detail, we'll circulate an update of what that looks like and any major problems for the LTP. And we also have a meeting booked with our audit team in 2 weeks. I requested it to be in the next week or two was the request. I'm guessing that they are going to get some advance notice of some whatever's going to land in this exposure draft, which is why they've waited till that first week of June. But that's absolutely fine. And we can provide a verbal update to maybe Strategic Planning Committee of what that all looks like. So yeah, other than that, is there any questions, concerns? I'm sure there's concerns. We've all got concerns around the table that anyone wants to discuss now. Otherwise, we will let you have a wee lunch break and then come back for a PX discussion and some, I guess, advice from Elliot on any problems.
And while when Mike comes, it's not just about pools, it'll also be about the rec, because you know, just the borrowing and the depreciation on that stadium alone will be a 1.6% increase of rates when water's gone. So the percentage looks higher because we'll have a base of only 1.5, well, about 105 million, and yeah, relatively it looks at a bigger percentage, but it's you know, about 7% of 24 million has to be covered.
Me and Nigel, have you got anything before we break for lunch?
No, you're good, thanks. But what time are we back?
Maybe, yeah, 10 past 1.
You can go and have a limb sip and lie down, Nigel.
It's a question to Nigel Droner. The stormwater thing, I know you talked about it earlier. So does that decision need to be made before we sort of continue on LTP development as to whether or not it's going to go? And really, when are you expecting that we'll need to make that decision around stormwater?
Change the numbers, but our stormwater team is tiny. It's only about 3 people, 2 or 3 people. So effectively, for these numbers on the OPEX.
So once again, these numbers here exclude stormwater currently, and it will continue to exclude stormwater because stormwater will ultimately be treated like a CCO. So the fact that we are keeping it in-house doesn't change the LTP. The LTP excludes it. It's just when we bring everybody together, they'll get consolidated in as if they were a external CCO.
Thank you, team. See you back here at 1 for 1:15 restart.